love. It's far. No, they will take this for you. How do you call it? The ladder. They don't do that. We want to put this microphone next to the speaker, but we have nothing for step now. Oh, yeah. We need to put this. We need to put this on the speakers, but they are too high, so we need something that we use either to step on, or we could just use something to push it up there.
Listen, I bet these guys to get to a ladder. He's going to.
Okay.
Kali. The guys.
Stabilizing the steer. We could put this on top of this, then this one is under, needs to go up there.
Okay.
But
this one will go up.
you just hang it on the stick.
See?
Hold for it.
Yeah. Thank you.
They put it up here. Somewhere where it won't fall. Maybe that thing outside.
Okay.
everyone. My name is Coordinator, Foundation for Immunization.
Morning, Professor Zubingo, researcher of family.
Good morning, everyone. My
debate in this country is about minimum wage, minimum wage. And we all know, or as we are doing here, we are talking about the reasons for and against minimum wage legislation. But I need to note that what I understand about minimum wage is that it's about raising workers' wages, the level of the poverty, the finish the poverty line. In Uganda, anyone not above $1 is considered to be above the poverty line. Now we see how elementary that measure is, but if you ask me, because it was very well, this is an international measure. I was made to understand that at the international level, this one who was highlighting this, the poverty line shifted from $1 to 1.25. But I think for Uganda, we are still stuck at $1. So as long as you're able to spend 3,000, it's now 3,300 Uganda shillings per day, we are not considered poor in this country. So the essence of the minimum wage is to ensure that every worker, whenever someone goes out to work, they're able to get a wage equal or above poverty line. Of course, that's a very interesting discussion whether we want to pay our minimum wage $1 by both families that so every answer on that. The other thing that I want to highlight is that interestingly, we have a minimum wage board in this country. I announced that I think last week. So we have a board in place. But you see, the other thing is that we have a minimum wage legislation in place. Enacted, I think, so many decades ago. The last time the minimum wage was set or adjusted was 1984, and it was 6,000 shillings. But even with these 6,000 shillings, I don't think during those years it was enforced. So we need to note that we have a minimum wage. That minimum wage is 6,000 shillings a month. Of course, we know the inflation changes in the economy. That's the one that is high. But as we are going to hear from the panelists, whenever you talk about the minimum wage legislation, we raise different or divergent opinions. The President of the Republic of Uganda will tell you that we don't need a minimum wage. And he has his reasons. One of them is stay away, investors. Because in other countries that are asking them to pay the minimum wage. So let's leave it to the process of demand and supply until a time when we reach a certain level of development, then we can institute the minimum wage. Some stakeholders, employees, civil society actors, are saying no, wait a minute. We have so many of our employees who are being exploited. They are being paid peanuts. They are working overtime. Probably minimum wage. So I think the basis of this meeting
This act further empowers the minister, that is the Minister of Labor, to establish minimum wage for different categories of employees. It does not necessarily state that different sectors, but it talks about different categories of employees. And I believe the different categories of employees may be in different sectors. So my interpretation of the act is to the effect that it empowers the minister to provide for establishment of the minimum wage in different sectors of the economy, as and when he deems it fit. Possibly the minister has not yet deemed it fit for other sectors apart from those that we have already mentioned. The act talks about the constitution of this board, and that is provided for in the schedule to the act. The schedule provides that the minister may appoint 3 persons to the board. One of them is supposed to be a chairperson. It also provides that the minister may appoint 2 other persons representing employers and representing employees. So in total you have 7 persons. The qualifications are, however, not indicated. So this is left to the whims of the minister, is the one to determine who qualifies. It also provides for the appointment of assessors during the proceedings of the board. The qualifications of the assessors are not provided for. These points I'm making maybe are clearly provided for in the bill, as we shall find out. Maybe those are the areas that were discovered by the Honorable Member of Parliament as being deficient in the current legislation, but I will leave that to the panelists that will discuss that. This bill, the act that we have, does not provide a mechanism for punishing employers that do not comply. So we are talking about the government not being in position to implement the law or being slow in implementing the law, but we must also consider the employers. I think we have employers' representatives here. Are they ready to implement that law? And if they don't, what happens to them? The act seems to be silent on that. And according to our peers, particularly Tanzania, this has been the biggest problem. Some employers have complied, some have not complied, irrespective of the fact that a minimum wage has been put in place. And the compliance level is at 55%. That means the other percentage has not complied. In Uganda, we don't even have that sanction. If we don't have the sanction, how do we expect the employers to comply, especially if there aren't minimum wage? There is a problem. The new bill, I don't know that it is new. It has been around for some time, since the 9th Parliament. It was presented, I think, in 2015. Has proposals to amend or repeal. I think they will decide whether to amend, repeal, or maybe revise the laws that we have. We shall have a few highlights of this bill. What does it propose? Does it propose a different position from what we have? About the powers of the minister, the bill proposes to give the minister powers to appoint the minimum wage board. It has similar provisions like the current act. The minister has the discretion to determine whether it is necessary and when it is necessary to appoint that board. However, the bill goes ahead to give guidelines. If the minister decides to appoint, whom should he appoint? The persons that can be appointed are clearly stated: representatives of various stakeholders, including the government, the employers' bodies, that is Federation of Uganda Employers, the labor unions. We no longer have trade unions, but it talks about trade unions, but they are labor unions. They are supposed to be represented. That is the representation that the bill proposes. I don't know whether this is a representative of all the employees in Uganda that may be affected. We are aware that not all employees in Uganda are unionized. Some of them are not. In fact, a majority of them are not. So how are they supposed to be represented? The memorandum says it should be employer-employee-led negotiation, but maybe the proposal is employer unionized employees-led negotiation, and that is in respect of the board. The bill, however, proposes to introduce another method of determination of minimum wage, and that is contractual determination. Employees and their employers can negotiate, and once they negotiate, that the outcome of their negotiation will be binding on the employer, and it has to be approved by the minister, and once approved by the minister, it has to be enforced by the employers. The bill further proposes a sanction for the persons that do not comply, and that is in clause 15. I think that is intended to ensure compliance. The board, according to the bill, is supposed to be in place not only for determination of the minimum wage, but also to consider the conditions of work. The minimum wage may be sufficient, but under unfair conditions of work. So all the conditions of work are also supposed to be considered. It is proposed that the determination of the minimum wage should be based on sectors, so it is supposed to be a sectoral determination. Why? Different sectors have different profitability levels, and therefore it would be unreasonable to establish a uniform minimum wage. In our peers, this is what has been done. Tanzania, Kenya, they have a sectoral minimum wage. Different amounts are set for different sectors. I think the basis is profitability. That is the proposal briefly under the bill. Now the question is, we have the bill, we have to determine whether it is necessary. We have the law. Is it sufficient? We have to analyze that. However, the question should be, do we need either? Do we need the current law? Do we need even that bill? Mr. Chitamilike did say people have been arguing for and against it. Maybe it is important for us now to look at the reasons advanced for and against, for us to determine whether we need the legislation. Why does Uganda need a minimum wage? I have already indicated Uganda is a member of the ILO, and therefore it is supposed to enforce its conventions. And as we have already indicated, establishment of a minimum wage is a requirement. Therefore, on that sole basis, one would say Uganda needs the minimum wage legislation. And some people will say we already have one, and possibly we don't need any other because we have complied with the convention. However, there are other reasons as to why Uganda, some people say, does not need the minimum wage. One, it reduces investment and growth. We have representatives of investors here. Some of them are keen on this legislation because it affects them. It is stated that one of the fundamental principles of economies is that people tend to buy more when the price is lower and less when the price is high. A minimum wage, it is alleged, increases the cost of labor, which in turn increases the general cost of doing business. When the cost of doing business is increased, certainly the prices of the products goes up. When the prices go up, definitely the consumption goes down. This affects their investment. To them, they allege it is a disincentive to investment. And that is what the president has also been stating, as clearly indicated by Mr. Kitamirike. There is a claim that countries that have adopted a minimum wage have not improved in their GDP at all. They are not any better than Uganda. Comparisons have been made with Kenya, Tanzania. Their GDP has not tremendously improved upon introduction of the minimum wage. So this is counter to the argument that a minimum wage improves on the GDP of a country. The examples we have from Kenya and Tanzania are quite clear. The effect on the GDP is quite minimal. They have 5.6 and 7% respectively. Uganda is at 5. I don't think that is any better than us. That is what the proponents say, and not myself. It is also alleged that establishment of a minimum wage increases unemployment. And I think this is obvious. Labor is going to become expensive. And when labor becomes expensive, the employers will be unwilling to take on expensive labor. You will be guaranteed a living wage towards some years. You will be guaranteed an income above the poverty line. That is if you get the job. But where is the guarantee that you are going to get the job? There is no such guarantee. What does it lead to? Employers will take on employees that are willing to work for lesser pay. Those that are not willing to work for lesser pay will not certainly be taken on. We have a majority of our Ugandans being the unskilled. And these are the people we are talking about. They are the majority. But we are telling them they need a minimum wage. When they apply for jobs, they expect a minimum wage. And if they are not offered the minimum wage, they believe they can get it somewhere else. They will keep loitering around looking for that minimum wage. They may never find the minimum wage. If there is unemployment in this country and the policy of the government is Uganda becoming a middle-income country by the year 2021, can we become a middle-income country when people are unemployed? Where is the income? Certainly there is no income. And we shall have middle income for certain sectors and no income at all for certain persons in Uganda. That is if we go ahead with establishment of the minimum wage. These are some of the reasons that are given. There are several others that we shall get from you and the panelists. But there are also reasons for the establishment of a minimum wage, and it is up to you to decide whether they are overwhelming. A minimum wage is intended to improve the welfare of the citizens, and this is the principle by International Labour Organization, and this is one of the reasons advanced by the proponents for a minimum wage. The welfare of the citizen is paramount. This was the reason advanced in Kenya and Tanzania. Those are also liberalized economies. The cost of labor, like all other costs, are solely moderated by the forces of demand and supply in these economies. And if they are regulated by forces of demand and supply, what do you do to protect your citizens? If you are to protect them from the capitalists, the investors, you need to establish a minimum wage such that you guarantee them a good life, just as the policy of the Uganda government is. Ugandans must have a good life by the year 2021. What do we have now? We can have a few statistics. Security guards in Uganda earn $1.14. That is daily. That is their daily wage, 1.14. Domestic workers earn 64 cents. Food vendors earn $1.51. Casual laborers earn $1. Mr. Chitaminika, I don't know whether that is below or above the poverty line. Plantation laborers earn 60 cents. Mechanics, $3.5. Shop attendants, $1. Carpenters, $4. Waiters, $1. Cleaners, 46 cents. That is Uganda. We must get these people from this level to the middle income by the year 2021. How do we get them from these levels to middle income by the year 2021? The only solution is establishing a minimum wage. I believe that will help us get there. The other reason is, if you establish a minimum wage, you are going to reduce on strikes. We have strikes for people that are earning above what we may take to be a minimum wage. Makerere University is well known for this. If persons that are at that level are striking, what do you expect from persons that are at the levels we are talking about? It is even worse. So what do you do about that to avoid those strikes? Give them a minimum wage, which may be a living wage, and therefore the middle income wage, and you will not have the strikes. What is the effect of strikes on the investments and the economy? Definitely, once employees strike, there will be no productivity, and therefore the investment will be adversely affected. South Africa has experienced this. Some of the investors have never recovered from the losses that were incurred during lockouts or strikes. Is that where we want to go? Proponents say that is not where Uganda wants to go, especially if you are to encourage investors here. Investors must be certain that when they employ workers, the workers will certainly do their work, and therefore they will reap from their investment. The other reason is public interest aspirations. The citizen is protected by the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda, and therefore the government is enjoined to ensure that the Constitution is observed. The directive principles of state policy in this Constitution are to the effect that in enforcing and interpreting the Constitution, the government and other bodies are supposed to ensure a just, free, and democratic society. Still under the same constitution, the state is entitled, or it is enjoined, to fulfill the fundamental rights of all Ugandans to social justice and economic development. And particularly, it is supposed to ensure the well-being of the citizens of Uganda. All Ugandans are supposed to enjoy equal rights, opportunities, access to education, health services, clean and safe water. They are supposed to work under decent environment, shelter. They are supposed to have adequate clothing, food security, pension and retirement benefits. How does the government ensure that this is achieved? The only way that the government can ensure that this is achieved is by establishing a minimum wage. That is what is stated. Briefly, that is all I can say about the minimum wage, the legislation, and the reasons for and against this legislation. It is therefore incumbent upon us to discuss and decide whether we have sufficient legislation, whether we need the legislation to be amended. It is also incumbent upon us to determine whether we need to get involved in this discussion. Is it relevant at all? These questions will be answered by the members here present. I thank you for listening to me, and I wish you fruitful deliberations.
Thank you very much, sir, for your elaborate presentation. And thankfully, you have cut the parameters for this debate by asking the fundamental questions on: is the current law sufficient? Should it be amended? And should we participate in the process? On that note, I would like to invite our panelists for the day. I would like to invite you again, Mr. Henry Wambuga from Acadia Advocates. I'd like to invite you to please take your seat at the panel. I'd also like to invite Mr. Douglas Opio from the Federation of Employers to please take his seat. I'd also like to invite Mr. Wilson Owere, who is the chairman of the National Association of Trade Unions, to please take his seat. I would also like to invite Mr. Jacob Yeru, who is a former youth ambassador to the East African community, to please take his seat. And before anyone complains that it's an all-male panel, I would like to invite the Honorable Adeke Anna, the National Female Youth MP, to please take her seat at the panel. Maybe the lady should sit in the middle. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our distinguished panel for the day. The submission, we want the question at hand today is, do we need or don't we need it? Side of the minimum wage bill or even the existing law as it stands today. Thank you very much. Is it possible to switch on his microphone?
Thank you so much, and I very much appreciate the presentation from my neighbor here. Was an excellent one. I want to comment on a few things, starting with the bill. First of all, we need to ask ourselves, whose minimum wage and for what? When you read in the bill, it talks about all workers, essentially all categories of workers. This is a flawed thinking. When we're talking about a minimum wage, we are not talking about a wage structure. So you're not talking about the law setting a wage structure for companies, for institutions. So that has to be addressed. Secondly, the bill addresses this partially. Who pays the minimum wage? That's a fundamental question we need to ask ourselves. As the bill is now, it's a bill for the private sector because it excludes the public sector. But is that the motivation? If our intention is to change the condition of living, are we looking at only those who are in the private sector? Government employees not entitled to the same? And aside from that, we have a very large informal sector. Are we talking about a minimum wage for the formal private sector, excluding the informal sector? The keynote speaker made a presentation and pointed a number of low-wage categories, including shopkeepers. Are those part of the formal private sector, the part of the informal sector? Now, are we setting a minimum wage that caters for less than 10% of our population? Because the informal sector is nearly 90% of our population. So in that case, are we bringing everybody away from poverty, or we are just picking a few? That's first and foremost, those two for me are fundamental questions that have to be addressed, which essentially the bill doesn't talk about at the moment. Very important also, the bill wants to regulate including conditions of employment. This is outside the remit of a minimum wage bill. We have an Employment Act that squarely deals with that. So this bill should focus on what it's meant to do. That's issue of wages and what's related to wages, not trying to cover everything. Very important also, when you look at clause 8.2, it talks about appointment of a minimum wage board to set wages for a given sector. We have to be clear. Do we envisage a situation where we have a national minimum wage board, or do we envisage a situation where we have several boards for several sectors, implying each sector has its own minimum wage board? Because as the bill is now, it's completely unclear about that. The other issue that I want to raise from the bill is the issue of representation. When you constitute a board, and then you make my colleagues, Asha, more represented than the employers, you create a problem. You refer to ILO as a convention, Convention 144 on tripartism that provides for equal representation between employers and workers, and that to allow proper debate, but also to ensure that issues are not missed out simply because some people have numbers. And then when it comes to a vote, it's not about how strong your case is, but it's also about how many people do you have on your side. So that has to be taken into account. It talks about a sort of a two-tier kind of minimum wage, one set by the national board, and then the other, a contractual one, which he ably explained, set through collective bargaining arrangement. Is that, why do we need it at that level then? He talked about us learning from our peers. Kenya and Tanzania, they have a sectoral minimum wage at the moment, but they are under review because it's a complex system. Do you want negotiation going on for, in India, for instance, over 1,200 minimum wages? Do you want negotiation going on for nearly 20 sectors? When will those negotiations be concluded? Do we get a minimum wage by starting with a very complex system? Why not have a single national minimum wage? Because when you create a situation where you have to establish several minimum wages and you completely have no experiences in establishing one, how long will those negotiations take? How long will the processes be? But even then, the argument that some sectors could afford to pay better is a flawed one. The workers we are talking about go to the same markets. It's not like if I work in the agriculture sector, then there's another market for the construction people. So if the objective is really picking people out of poverty, then we need to take that into account. So from the side of the employers, we need to address certain things first and foremost, especially the informal sector. Most of these employers in the formal sector will comply, but then it's just a small portion. So we need to rethink if the broader goal is helping us to attain Vision 2040. You don't attain Vision 2040 by catering for less than 10% of your working people. And these are this is just about 2 million out of a working class of over 14 million. You wouldn't have done much in terms of addressing that. And then, of course, why employers are central is the issue of ability to pay. It's a proven fact that companies close down because costs are high. And we have seen it happen in South Africa. He was talking about South Africa, but also in Namibia. Let's not just think jobs are moving from America and going to China. Even within Africa itself, tea factories have closed in South Africa here. So it's a real thing, and those are where our most vulnerable people are. So let's take that into account. And then, of course, there must be other complementary arrangements. For instance, you look at pay as you earn. For our case in Uganda, we tax people who earn very low. Why not raise the pay as you earn higher? You give somebody minimum wage that will be taken away by tax. Does that make much sense? Maybe do a complementary work and raise the pay as you earn threshold. So we need to look at it not in isolation, but alongside other complementary policies.
To stop you there for a while, and
thank you.
Please, thank you very much for your submissions.
Thank you.
To that note. There are key questions that arise, and I don't know whether you agreed on how to sit, but I think we will follow that flow. But there are key questions that arise. For example, what happens to government employees? The question on the informal sector, which is a huge aspect of the economy. But more importantly, in some of his submissions, the question on protection emerges, though very subtly. So what happens in the case that you do not have the right structure in society to be able to protect? Because the assumption is that if you enforce this with the employers, then at the end of the day, the person who pays is either the employee or the end beneficiary. So I'm going to move this conversation on to the National Union, the National Organization of Trade Unions, because I want to believe that you may be among the biggest pushers for this bill. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Ashaul Sonowere.
Yes.
I'm the Chairman General of National Organization of Trade Unions, NOTO. First of all, before I go to your question, I just want people to understand and the definition of minimum wage as far as workers are concerned. First of all, minimum wage is a statutory performance standard fixed for the employers to ensure fair returns to the labor used. It is also a benchmark wage below which no employer is expected to pay as much as it is a protection measure to the welfare of workers, and this is the mandate of the Ministry responsible for labor. Now, you are talking about the structure. There's already a structure, even in the bill, and Ministry of Labor is responsible. Even the mechanism on how to push. Now, I just want to answer one question where my brother here was raising, that the number of employers, workers on that, if in the law, are more than the employers. Employer is already powerful. Employer has the money, he has the power to fire and hire. Now, when you add him more number, what is the essence? Even now, the resistance about the minimum wage, it comes from them, because they can even twist government and tell government, no, we're not, because we are the investors, you can't bring the minimum wage. You see that kind of power. So we need, in this law must have also to guard the workers, and that's what we mean. So, my brother, don't worry, you already have the power, you have the money. So, the other one is just additional. Now, the objective is protection of non-unionized workers who are out there. Actually, as I talk now, workers are suffering. A few days ago, we are receiving many calls, mainly from the investors, actually from Asian countries, are the most people who are exploiting workers in this country. Now, what we need to do is the structure. There's no problem with the structure. Now, terms and condition of service is also something that is going to be provided. Now, it is also going to provide benchmark guidelines for investors so that they can accurately estimate the labor cost. Let me tell you one thing. If somebody comes to your house, because I don't buy the idea of somebody saying, because the investors, when they come, when there's no minimum wage, they are going to, we are going to have many. I'm very happy with the presenter, the council. You really made a very good presentation, and I want to thank you. In your own house, you must have laws. If you allow somebody to come from out and enter your house anyhow, you can even disorganize you in the bedroom. So there is no way you can tell that investors should come here, and because you are just fearing them, not to regulate. Putting in minimum wage is just regulating our labor and ensuring that we have safeguards. This is very simple. And one thing I want also to inform the audience here, that NOTO and Federation of Uganda Employers, we are already debating this issue. His attitude has changed. And we have agreed that, yes, there's need for minimum wage. And minimum wage must be set with our brothers and sisters from Federation of Uganda Employers, they are saying, let's have it sector by sector. And when we have it sector by sector, because why are they, for us we don't mind if it is one at a go, but it was a suggestion from them themselves. They said, okay, you people, if you want minimum wage, let's have it what? Sector by sector.
Can I interject just a little bit? He talks about the complementary arrangements. Would you want to shed more light on the complementary arrangement? Because under that he talks about the pay as you earn. He talks about the other taxes that all of us are subjected to. And then in the same breath, he also talks about the government workers. So what is your take on that as the National Organization of Trade Unions? If we're talking about equity.
When you, the issue of government workers, minimum wage is not going to separate that this is the government worker and this is private.
But the bill clearly states so.
The law must be uniform.
But the bill is very clear. Actually, it's the first, it's the opening remark in the bill.
Actually, we have a position paper which we have shared with them. And that position paper, we are saying, let it be married so that it's not segregating, that it is the private sector without the government. But as we talk now, the government workers are already above minimum wage. What they are clamoring for is now living wage. There's a difference between minimum wage and living wage. Because minimum wage, I've explained to you, it is the basic. Now, when you come to, that's where we disagree with people who are saying minimum wage will scare investors. Actually, the investors are scared of paying taxes. And by getting scared, they try to threaten government and say, we are not, and as we talk now, government is not even getting 30% of what is supposed to get from employers. In fact, that money would even be creating more jobs than scaring people guaranteed of retirement package. If it was paying taxes, the government would be having more money to invest in roads and so on, so that it creates more jobs. Are we together? So these are areas where we must really critically analyze and look at them entirely.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there, and thank you very much. And I'm going to take this conversation over to Jacob Beyeru. And I would like you to respond to a few of the things that have come up from his submission, but also some of the arguments that were raised in the first submission that were not responded to in the second submission. So over to you.
Thank you. My name is Jacob Beyeru, and I'm very glad to be here. I would like to start from the point he left it at. The question of whether government is actually trying to elevate the status of people, if you want it for the private sector and not the public sector. That question is very important, because then we are telling the private investors and the private players to make sure that they part with a particular pay for their workers that government workers cannot enjoy. Now, that question goes back to the amount of pay. When we say that we are setting a minimum wage, is it, first of all, above the living wage? That is a very important question. Government sector does not adopt a living wage, but they want a minimum wage that is probably higher or lower. We will discuss that when the minimum wage comes. But the question of whether the public servant has even a living wage is a very important one. Then you cannot have a minimum wage that is below a living wage. If the government sector players and workers are actually saying we want a living wage, it means they're already below a living wage. Now, if they are below a living wage, a minimum wage can only go higher. So we understand the position of government in trying to protect itself, that we can keep giving you a lower wage than the living wage. For the benefit of those of us that don't understand these terms, a living wage is the wage that allows you to live normally in society. You can pay your water bills, you can pay electricity bills, you can just live in that society. Now, in the Ugandan society, to just live is already very bad enough because our situations keep fluctuating. Government deposits money when it pleases, it reports to us when it pleases. We do not have a structured way of operation that is obeyed. The president will to do something and it will affect the economy whenever he pleases to. So we need to first of all agree at what is living wage. And we cannot determine a living wage until we can keep a constant pattern in the economy, because then the living wage will keep fluctuating. When we adopt a living wage, a minimum wage, it will become harder for trade unions to argue a position of elevating a minimum wage, because then the employers become protectionist in their approach. How do I go about a minimum wage? A minimum wage is mandatory payment to the workers. So if the workers keep raising the minimum wage, if government keeps raising the minimum wage, then the employer cannot continue to employ us. And that takes me to the second argument, starting from Mr. Wambuga. The argument that a minimum wage actually raises household incomes and actually elevates us to the middle income status that we're looking at in 2021 is a very big fallacy. We are really lying to ourselves that when you increase the pay of the workers, you elevate the possibility of reaching a middle income status. Well, we have elevated the pay, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the conditions of our economy remain constant. And that has been tested in South China, and it has not worked. It has been tested in California, it has not worked. When you raise the minimum wage of the people, you do not necessarily raise their living standards, okay? And so the question of more money into the economy being used to calculate the level of economic development, saying we are at that level of middle income, will work. That we have more money and therefore we divide the money by the number of people. They are at this level and therefore we are at a middle income status. But are the people even living? Is the first question, and I think that's a very important question. The second thing I would like to talk about is the enforceability of such legislation. Can we enforce such legislation in this vast and wide grouping of an informal sector? A minimum wage will be enforceable where we can collect data very easily, where we can follow up on data very easily. But if our economy is almost entirely informal, the largely formal part is the public sector, which is exempted from this notion, which is exempted from this conversation by the bill, then we are treading a really, really slippery ground. We need to be honest to ourselves and say, look here, we need data to actually enforce a minimum wage. If we cannot collect data, and that's the challenge Kenya has had, that's the challenge Tanzania has had, when you have a very informal economy that has most of its GDP embedded through the informal sector, that means you cannot control the informal sector. The employers in the informal sector will work to their advantage. The rate I pay a worker is how much produce I can get from the worker, as opposed to this worker must earn this particular amount. It will affect real estate, it will affect production in industry, it will affect manufacturing, it will affect all those people that feel that I cannot keep paying as much as the workers want. I will pay as many workers as I can afford. So in effect, we will also have a reduction in production. The question that I find very exempted, and I hope Honorable Adeke here will talk about it, is the question of the women. We have labor laws in this country that mandate us to have at least a third of our workers as women. Now, when you introduce a minimum wage and you do not clearly define how that minimum wage will be structured with those gender terms, you are going to effectively affect the working of the women, where they are being, I fear to say, they are being used to, fit in the numbers. There are areas in work where our women
and put there to actually just constitute the third. So when we are audited, we can say we are actually having the gender representation. And when we have conversations on the minimum wage, the employer will begin to look at the productivity of labor. And so that will be more competitiveness of our women. When you talk about more competitiveness, then you're talking about a lot of factors, including our educational outlook, including our opportunities in this country, and how we actually pay attention to gender mainstreaming. So that also becomes another conversation. Now, my major emphasis today is on why we are trying to adopt these positions. Well, Uganda is a member of the EAC. The EAC mandates that each country, each member state should try and implement a minimum wage position because it is a member of the EAC. Our argument as Uganda extends even further to being party to the ILO terms. So we are trying to achieve these positions because we are part of these bodies. But the question is, are these positions beneficial to us in our current state? And that question for me is answered in the negative. And we need to answer those positions before we can go on. So when we talk about a minimum wage being central, we are talking about a lot of terms, including unemployment. How do you relate the minimum wage effects to the unemployment rates in this country? Is it enforceable then, where people are very unemployed? They will simply say, no, I can basically work below the minimum wage. We do not have to tell the government. And so it becomes also a question of whether it will actually address the unemployment question. And that for me is a big discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Jacob. And Mr. Ayo talks about our economy. And if our economy is at a point that it can take in the minimum wage conversation, but you also bring in the conversation of employment, which is a big deal, I know, for the youth MPs hiding, because that is something that they're trying to deal with. So at this point, I'm going to invite Honorable Wanene to take the conversation forward. After which we are going to take a break from the panel, come to the audience very briefly, and then come back so that we are sure we are on the right page. Thank you, Isabella. My name is Adeti Anaifato. I'm the National Women MP, and I would like to welcome the panelists this afternoon and our key speaker, who just a few months ago was my lecturer. Thank you very much. So Jacob introduced the conversation about the employment question, and I don't think the provision of minimum wage will in any way sort out our unemployment crisis, because you see, we have already noticed that some of the flaws in the law is that it focuses on the public sector, and most of the young people in our country are in the informal sector. So they are in agriculture. We have not provided for a way to regulate that sector to make it easily possible for the young people to get into employment. So I don't think that the minimum wage can sort out our unemployment crisis. However, it can protect the young people who are in employment. Because you see, when it comes to competition for jobs, in most cases you find that most of the higher paying jobs require so much experience, which young people fall short of because they're just out of school and they don't have a very big CV. So most often, oftentimes they occupy the low paying jobs, and sometimes they get very little money. So I think it's important to protect those young people who get into employment because they are very susceptible to exploitation by their employers. But of course, when we speak about minimum wage, we have to keep in mind how realistic the amount the minimum wage is. Jacob has spoken about a living wage, and I know that the findings of the board put it at about 65,000. 65,000 is very little money because many employers will take advantage of that and say, as long as I'm above that, then I'm okay with government. So you're a young person, you're starting out in life, and you have 65,000. Electricity, your probably will take about 50,000.
and then you have no money for water, you have no access to basic health care. So I think it's important to protect our young people in employment. But I think the bigger question about regulating the labor sector, the bigger question lies in regulating the entire economy. And that includes the informal sector, which in my view actually has most of the young people working there, and the women at that. When you mentioned about the effects that it could have, that having a minimum wage could have on maybe the consumers of the products will be the ones paying more because the employers don't want to lose out. I think that also denotes a bit of a failure to regulate the entire economy, because you're supposed to envision right from the production stage to the consumption stage how to distribute the cost. This is about equity. The spirit of the law is to enhance equity. And equity is not about giving everyone in equal amounts. It's trying to make all of them stand at an equal level. So really, if that's the spirit of the law, then I think our argument should go beyond just regulating the labor sector, but even the entire production sector, the investment sector, all of that should be regulated. And I still think that any leader, really, who would put the investors ahead of the citizens has the priorities wrong. Because these are investors. First of all, if you're an investor, you want to invest in a country, and you don't even want to comply with a basic requirement such as minimum wage, you simply achieve. Because you simply want to be doing what I'm being called milking a cow and without feeding it. So you're taking from here and you're not giving back. Because our country is also going to be earning from its labor. So we really need to help our labor force. But away from that, I think a lot of focus has to be drawn to regulating the informal sector, where a lot of the money comes from, and the country loses so much money, which would have been gained in tax because it has continuously failed to regulate the informal sector. It's promising, and it can really earn our country. When it comes to the argument about women, women form most of the labor force in both the formal and informal sectors. But most times in the formal sector, they occupy the least paying jobs. And I have a bit, I think the statistics tell us about 50% of those in the formal sector occupy the lowest ranking jobs. Now, if you have a minimum wage, which is above the living wage, then you're helping these young women who are in such positions. Because most of the households in our country are actually run by women. So you end up helping the entire family live above the poverty line if you have this running. But then how can we help the women who are in the informal sector, who are in agriculture, in mining and quarry, in household management? How can we help them also benefit from this? And once again, I think it's about equity. Equity between government and private sector, because government should also not be exempted from providing for its public servants, and also equity between the informal and formal sector. I think if government envisions that, and it's able to have a holistic approach towards this, to touch everywhere, at least within the chain of production, consumption, in the entire economy, then we can actually see the law doing something tangible. Otherwise, I don't think it can operate in a vacuum. We can't have good laws. It's actually precedented that Uganda has the best manicured laws. They are perfect, but the spirit behind them is lacking. So I think that's what we need to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Anna. And for those of you who may have just joined us or who watched during the conversation, we are talking about if Uganda needs the minimum wage legislation, and that's why that conversation has been happening. Of course, before we come to the audience, there are questions that have emerged, and for one reason or the other, they have been dropped along the way. For example, with the trade unions, there's a question on the boards. Are you going to have recurring boards per sector? How does the board conversation
brought up. No, not taking now. I just want you to write it down somewhere so that you can respond to it. And then there was also the question on equity, which I believe you glossed over, but I would like to respond to. Why is government heavily represented on these boards against the employers? Because you cannot say that the employers will more power than the state. It does not really sound right. And at the end of the day, after the 5-man conversation, as council was supposed to start before, after the 5-man conversation, there are key questions that emerged on the minimum wage.
There's one on gender. There's a gender question, and I hope it can be responded to by the first 3, because it came from the last 2. So there's the gender question. There is also the question on regulating the informal sector within the context of the minimum wage bill. Also, there is the question on the minimum wage versus the living wage, and where do we hit a compromise between the two. Lastly, which is my own question, is there an alternative to the minimum wage conversation? On that note, I'm going to open the conversation up to the audience. We will take 6 submissions and then bring it back to the panel. So there's one submission here. Should I assume that this is the only person who has a query? So there are 2 submissions, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and then we are going to close. So any rejoinders shall come up after. So we'll just have 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. Is there a spare microphone?
I think I can be what you want.
All right. Okay, let's...
Thank you. These gender roles. Anyway, my name is Ellen. Like I said, I work with the Uganda Parliamentary Forum on Youth Affairs. I think this is an interesting discussion, and working with young people, I think we are hitting there, because for us in the National Youth Manifesto, we were very clear that there needs to be regulation of labor and also a good discussion about the minimum wage bill. If my knowledge about legislation serves me well, I know that a bill which has been in the past parliament, if it has not been passed, then when it comes back to the new parliament, we will start the discussion afresh. So this is part of consultation. So my idea is that this consultation should go back into researching the actual labor status of Uganda. Because internationally, or in any process of policy analysis, is that laws or bills or policies should be made for the greater majority of the public. So if you are talking about a bill that is going to cater for the minority of the public, those who are already within the regulated labor force, then I don't think really it serves us well. We would then need to go back to the discussion of how do we regulate labor. Because I think that majority of the young people are actually, they don't have people they employ. If I run a small kiosk, I'm the chapati maker, I sell, I make the chapatis, I earn from my own profits. I don't even employ anyone. So the question is, how many employees employ people here? And how many, on average, how many people do the employees employ before we even talk about investments? So I think that's a greater question that needs to be discussed. For who is this law being made? And what is the percentage of Ugandans that will benefit from this law? I think for me that will help us then. Do we really need a minimum wage bill, or we need to have a whole discussion on regulating the informal sector that caters for most of young people? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My name is Ronald Bills. I now partly sell my labor for money by advising Uganda Coffee Federation. Just to pick from where Aaron stopped, and I want to go into the politics of legislation. My view about the minimum wage bill and discussion is like spending more time discussing the honeymoon venue and budget when you have not paid for church service. To to just contextualize the marriage plan. In my view, the labor force discussion, instead of picking on the minimum wage, for some of us who have been employed before, the status quo as it is now, there is, before you even wait for your end of month pay, the health and safety issues of our labor force. And I have been in working environments where these concerns are downplayed. The security of the contracts that these informal people make with the employers. And just to crown it all, what is the compliance levels of the employers now to things like NSSF, to things like URA? I would have loved the keynote speaker or the guy that the gentleman that is representing the employers to really shed some light, and Mr. Wede here. Currently, the state of our labor force in the country, what is the compliance with the laws or regulations that are standing right now? Then, before we take on another good legislation to feel good about it. For now, that's it, that we need to analyze the current state of our labor force and agree with Honorable Adeke that this cannot be discussed in isolation to the big picture of how the economy is working, but also more importantly, the work or labor force discussion as a whole. Thank you.
Just to the gentleman, thank you.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Muganga Katosi. I come from Song Africa. Basically, I would like to just emphasize, and the previous speaker mentioned a bit about it. For me, I have engaged in discussion with other colleagues previously because I am concerned about the situation of the worker. But I'm saying the fundamental point we must engage in as citizens of this country is how do we go forward to ensure that the spirit and the will of the current ruling political leadership prioritizes the interests of citizens as opposed to just the investors, and that includes the foreign ones and the lucky ones that have accumulated local capital, you know. Otherwise, if we do not commit to boldly attend to that, we shall be going in circles of these discussions. And the previous speakers have emphasized it, that this discussion should not be taken in isolation from the cost of doing business. When we put a minimum wage, will the local entrepreneurs be able to sustain business? However much they would love to give a good pay to their workers, you know. The cost of electricity, you know. And the political leadership has been making, the high cost of electricity is not coming out of the blue. It is about decisions of political leadership, you know. So how are we as tax-paying citizens ready to take another step of saying, guys, can we make the ruling political leadership accountable to the underlying causes that bring us to this situation? Yeah, so for me, that's what I wanted to address, and I hope to hear from people who are here, because the members who occupy this audience are what you would call the cream of the nation. But we would like to hear from you. How are you committing to give a bold voice, you know, of demanding better, effective government from the guys that are reigning in power as of now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And then lastly, to your neighbor.
Thank you. My name is Bernard Sabiti. I'm a researcher. I think we have a big problem in this debate, and it centers around data and evidence. I think somebody, the first speaker, hinted on that. I don't think either side of this debate has actually used data and evidence to make their case. Those that want a minimum wage yesterday, that have been fighting for many years, have really never empirically demonstrated the need for a minimum wage and what the impact in everyday workers' lives would be different from what their condition currently is. And on the other side, employers have really never demonstrated why a minimum wage is a job killer. I don't think they've ever convincingly done that. In other countries, especially the developed world, when these debates come up, there's always effort to actually study the impact. Bernie Sanders, you know, the one who was giving Hillary Clinton a hard time recently, was talking of $15 an hour minimum wage. Actually, he hired people to study what the impact of that would be. Republicans who are always against the minimum wage, they also involve their think tanks and all that, and actually study the impact of whatever increase they are advocating or decrease that they are advocating. In Uganda, this kind of evidence and empirical data really has been lacking. I have really not seen it. As a result, the minimum wage debate in Uganda has always appealed to emotion rather than reason. And that is a problem, because when you start appealing to emotion, you lose a lot of nuance. Because obviously you listen to somebody that's earning 50,000 a month and you imagine what 50,000 can do, and you indeed feel sad for this person. You just think about how you put it in your car as gas and it doesn't even take you for 2 days, and then you start saying, I think we need to increase the pay for these people. And then you forget the broader issues of the fundamentals of the economy, of the gross national product of this country, and the ability of this economy actually to sustain an endeavor like that one. So I think from the beginning we needed to fix that issue. I don't think any studies have been done, serious studies, maybe involving the Economic Policy Research Center, which would be a natural partner in this kind of thing. So we have not done that one. But now, that's of course idealistic. Let me come to the real world where we are living right now. Is a minimum wage necessary? I think if we appeal to common sense, you would expect that certain employers really should actually flash a torch to themselves and realize that they are paying slave wages to their employees. You would expect that if you are a security company and you are getting $1 million shillings, you are charging $1 million per security personnel from an organization, and then you give 100,000 to this employee, and then 2 days later the employee leaves that long gun at that organization and takes off with their laptops and computers, you would think that common sense would show you that this is an inevitability, that you should at least ensure that you give something to this person. Unfortunately, in the world in which we live in, common sense is a very rare commodity, which justifies the activism of Mr. Owere and his people, because they know, as Malcolm X said one time, if you wait for a person in power, in this case your employer, to decide that he should treat you fairly, you are going to wait a very long time. This is why these movements are always very important. So as I conclude, I want to submit that I think the best approach to go about it, actually, the little time I've spent looking at this and even comparatively, countries in the region which have tried to do something like this is to avoid this one-size-fits-all, one-off approach where you actually want to institute a comprehensive minimum wage, but actually involve yourself in a dialogue of all the stakeholders within the economic ecosystem and approach this maybe sectorally, look at those reasonable employers that are organized maybe in blocks, like an association of sugar manufacturers or whatever. They're actually reasonable people out there. And engage them and let's discuss how much should we pay our employees in this sector as a group. And I imagine those discussions can be encouraged. And then after you've fixed that, then you can take on a more nationalistic approach. Otherwise, right now, I think, probably this is why this debate has been going on since 1935, over 70 years. So I think we need to take a less confrontational approach and try to understand the arguments of both sides, because they are actually legitimate issues on both sides. So once you have the data, the evidence, you remove emotion out of it. Emotional people have never made rational decisions, ever. And then at the end, I think you will start coalescing around a common approach where this idea is comprehensively acceptable to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your submissions. And at this point, I'm going to move back to the panel. But even as we move back to the panel, I would like Mr. Wambuga to respond, in addition to anything else you would like to respond to the complementary arrangement that was spoken about by your neighbor as an alternative to minimum wage. Because at the end of the day, the key question on our tables is, do Ugandans need this bill or not? And I do not want to be the doomsday sayer, but clearly from the submissions, they are pointing towards another direction. But we will take another round of comments after that. So you could go in an order that is comfortable with whoever wants to start.
Thank you so much for people who have reacted and given their opinions. I respect that so much. I value your opinion, but first I want to put a disclaimer. Coming from the employers' organization, I want it to be clear that these are my personal opinions. I will speak my opinions, not that of the employers, because that's subject to consultation and a position that is agreed by members. So I'll start with the question on compliance. Compliance is from NSSF, from the registered members, it has been improving. Before 2010, it was less than 50% of registered employers. But by June 2015, it had risen to about 79%. So compliance from the registered members has improved greatly. But the other challenge on the compliance from NSSF is on registration. Not many employers have registered. They have, I would attribute it to less than 20% of the eligible employers. All employers who employ at least 5 employees and above are required to register. Not many of them have registered. So that side of registration, compliance is a big issue, but from the side of those who are registered paying, it's improving. From the side of tax, we are doing very badly. Our tax to GDP ratio is just about 12-13%, which is extremely low. So we are doing very badly on tax, but recent reforms that URA is trying to do, I think, will change that. Now we are trying to bring everybody into the tax bracket. Every small business has to have a tin. So eventually, over time, I think our compliance will improve as we address that. Then the Employment Act, we're doing extremely badly. At the district level, the labor officers are expected to inspect workplaces and to try and monitor compliance, but we have less than 40 of them in a country with nearly 119 districts. So you have the work being done by a community development officer and people who are really not well placed to handle labor matters. So compliance with the Employment Act is very problematic because we don't have a mechanism, a proper mechanism for monitoring and enforcing compliance. And then there are other issues like under the Labor Unions Act, we're supposed to have collective bargaining and register those CBAs. But as I talk now, less than 10 CBAs are registered with the ministry. So even just compliance with registering CBAs with the ministry, very low. The same problem moves into occupational safety and health. Most workplaces are not complying because if there is one labor officer in the district and is the same one who has to sit to attend to cases in his office, is the same one who has to move out and inspect workplaces. So we have a problem. The mechanism to enforce compliance is seriously lacking around that. Now, the other issue that I want to respond to, the gentleman talked about research. I think, I forget his name, but research is currently going. You're talking about EPRC. The Minimum Wage Advisory Board has actually contracted EPRC to do research. So there is ongoing research. Federation and NOTU, we are also doing research currently. So research is ongoing, and that will be based on evidence. You're saying we always talk about employment, the risk of unemployment, but then we don't quite have facts. We can only project based on what has happened in other economies because a minimum wage has not been introduced here. So we cannot conclusively say the effect. But from common sense, I would say, you'd understand that if wages are higher, any rational business person would try to cut costs. That's the immediate. We have seen companies downscaling even here, companies outsourcing. We have seen even companies closing down in this very economy. And then you highlighted, couldn't we start this at a sector level discussing the possibility of minimum wages? I want to inform you that those discussions are going on. For instance, in the Uganda Flour Exporters Association, they have a CBA arrangement, and in that CBA, there's a minimum wage for everybody in the flour sector. The issue, which is of course subject to debate, is as to whether the wage is high enough. It's 90,000 at the moment, but there are those arrangements we could learn from and then possibly improve it. The other issue of contracts alongside compliance, contracts is a big issue. Because in our law in Uganda, I can give you an oral contract, I can give you a written one. See, it's not criminal to just tell you, come and work tomorrow for 2 hours, I will pay you 10,000. Now, which records will the enforcement officer come to check? Because I just agreed with you verbally and I did not commit an offense. So, as we look at issues of the minimum wage, some of those reforms we'll have to consider, because if there is no record, there is no basis for verification. Many people might choose to do that. Just tell you to come and work, nothing written down. He has not committed any offense because the law provides for both oral and written. I think that's what I could possibly respond to. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm supposed to be neutral in this discussion.
Yes.
But it seems you want me to take sides, and I'll resist that. There is a problem that I'm realizing here. It seems this bill here that we are talking about has not been really appreciated. I think the bill is exhaustive on what is supposed to be done in determination of that minimum wage we are talking about. When you look at clause 8.7 of the bill, it clearly indicates what the body is supposed to do before it comes up with the minimum wage. It is supposed to look into a number of aspects. They're supposed to look at the state of the economy, sectors, peculiarity of sectors, profitability, skills of workers, several things, gender, needs of workers and their families, cost of living, level of productivity, state of the economy. So all these aspects are going to be considered by the board before it comes up with the minimum wage. We are talking about researching. They are researching, but even the board itself, in addition, is supposed to make inquiries in these matters, and that is in addition to the research that may have been done. So it is not going to be a one-day affair that the board is going to sit and just come up with the minimum wage. All concerned persons are going to be interviewed. And the bill proposes sanctions for people that are summoned to appear before the board and they do not. So every person, employers, my colleague here, will be summoned to provide information. Mr. Wede and his brothers will also be summoned to provide the relevant information to this board before a minimum wage is established. And if at all this is followed, in my view, the issue of whether we go sector by sector or generally can be sorted out. If we are to go generally, the terms that are provided for here, in my view, take good care of that. And for Mr. Wede, if you want the thing to succeed, you need the support of the employers. They must own the bill. If they feel that you are giving them a raw deal, then compliance may not be achieved. They will think it is your law, it's not theirs. So there is need for all of you to be adequately represented or equally represented on this board, such that they own, and once they own the act, once they own this law that you are proposing, enforcement will be no problem, because it will be their own legislation. That is all I have to add.
Out of curiosity,
please,
do you think that the penalties provided for are adequate enough?
When you talk about the penalty, let's look at the currency point and what it adds up to. So what is the currency point? The currency point is 20,000. And what is the penalty? 500. 500 currency points times 20,000. How much is that? Times the number of employees. The penalty here is stringent. It's heavy. So it will encourage compliance. However, even if you have a penalty here, it does not mean you are not going to have law breakers. We have prisons because the laws are there and they are broken. So even employers, you may have these as stringent as they are, but they will still break them. They will find a way of avoiding whatever is in here.
Okay, thank you very much. We will listen from Mr. Owere.
Yes, I want to agree with the council that we need the employers to own the act. And in fact, what we have done, as I told you, that we are working together. First in the research, which we are doing jointly. We are also jointly in on the board, on minimum wage board. The other aspect which I was telling you about the number, government has 3 people, then workers 2, and the employers 1. You know, government and employers, they are almost the same. Those are employers.
Yes.
So when you are talking about the 2, you have also to look at that aspect. So we are only just 2, and these people actually they are 3. Government and it's only when we go to International Labour Council, that's when we separate between government, workers, and employers. So we are there as a tripartite. Now, under tripartite, it is the government, the workers, and employers. And whatever we do there, we do it as tripartite. Somebody raised a very, very important issue about utilities. In fact, when you look at electricity charges now, it's the one which is actually discouraging. I would expect us now to even fight harder. Because if you look at the electricity, even in your home, the other day I got a bill of 370 something just for 1 month, and I'm only using bulbs and now I compare the factory. Now these are some of the things which kills jobs. Water, and you go to other things. So we also, I agree with the members that we need to look at those areas. Now, discussion, dialogue, being sober. You know, when I came in, our predecessors were very militant. They used to harass to government and so on. Now, for me, what I did was to bring in the aspect of dialogue, to consult everybody. In fact, since we started that, the level of government and employers opposing minimum wage has really reduced. Up to date, and with the other players like now you, the Platform for Labor and the rest, you find that the work is becoming more what? Easier. And more people are convinced, more people are understanding. Because even within government, most people don't know what is minimum wage. So the first thing is first to educate people, talk to them, tell them, convince them, build that confidence in them. And even the head of state, because it doesn't come out with anything, when it comes out, that means somebody technical. Start with him, as explain to him. Our colleagues, the members of parliament here, they were really, when you talk to most of them really, they tell you, you know, he will look at his home, how many people he's employing. Now we'll think about that and say, no, we can't do that. We can't talk about it. So at that level, you need to do a lot, and I want to thank the gentleman over there, that it is true. We need to sober up, we need to explain to more people, and me, I'm seeing this bill succeeding with the help of this organization and other actors. The sky is the limit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anna.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Well, I think that what the former speaker addressed us on the aspect of equity on the board is an indicator of the flaws, some of the flaws in the law that are causing these rifts between the stakeholders. But by and large, I still believe that the law is important for our country. But I consider it just a grain in the sand. For me, the dream is bigger than just having a minimum wage, because that's not even half of the population we are taking care of. If we really have to achieve a middle income status as a country, then we have a long way to go. It's achievable. It's the will that I don't see. Because why would it have taken us this long? Why do, every time we mention the minimum wage bill, why does the first thing that comes to the minds of the top leadership, why is it about investors? It's going to discourage investors. It's not about our nationals. It's not about young people in employment. It's not about the standard of living and the cost of living. It's just about investors. So I think we need to broaden the way that we embrace this. I hope that the bill will not be defeated. I hope it can be amended, because our discussion here has clearly indicated there are some flaws that should be worked on, and I hope it's passed. But for me, I think the dream should be bigger. What we need to advocate for is something bigger than just having a minimum wage.
Thank you very much. I can see the first four all did not handle the question of the informal sector, which was a very glaring aspect that came out during the submissions, but I hope that we can respond to it before we close. Yes.
Thank you. Again, the International Labour Organization says that how we extend the discussion of a minimum wage or its coverage over the informal sector is by its formalization. It goes back to the question of data. Do we have data on these sectors? For me, the advocacy point on this issue is where best to test the minimum wage. If our most organized area is the public sector, then it is best to test it where you can start from with everything. So we can then study what my brother here wants to find. That discussion not being based on emotion, but on figures. And on reality and on its impact. But if we exempt the most organized part, then we are exempting ourselves from a worthy discussion. We are going into a private sector where the discussion is dictated by the players. It's not dictated by the government. The players will say something, the trade unions will say something, and we have to honor these positions. When these positions are not harmonized, we will never have this bill implemented, this law or act implemented. I think we do not have a challenge in its passing. It depends on who has interest in its passing. If we know in our parliament that if there are particular people that have an interest in the passing of something, it will pass. If they are not, if you don't have their backing, it will probably not pass. So I do not think that's where the challenge is. I think our challenge will be maintained to how we relate these to our realities in the economy. And that, for me, is where the discussion must be centered. The chairperson, Chairman General of a trade union association in our country, has not told us how many trade unions are actually in this country and whether all sectors have trade unions before we have a sectoral discussion on a minimum wage. There has to be someone to negotiate for the labor force. If we cannot have a conversation with a particular body, then we will restrict ourselves to experts in these sectors who will not still represent the voices of the labor force adequately. The other question that I felt had a strong grounding in the audience is the question of whether we are making this law for the greater majority or we are making this law for particular people. And that question could as well be categorized with the discussion of how the economy is organized. When you introduce a minimum wage in this economy, who will be able to be tracked on its implementation? Are they in the majority category or they're in the minority category? I think that very honestly, we need to address ourselves to the impact of the law, whether it is full scale or the discussion of being full scale is in itself foolhardy. We need to come down to terms with the realities of our economy. Can we actually have this law implemented in northern Uganda, in eastern Uganda, in central Uganda, or we are going to talk about the industrial sector, we're going to talk about I may be finding hardship because the sectors in the public have been erased away from the discussion. And very finally, I find that the idea of a minimum wage should always be compared to a living wage. And this was where we started. When you introduce a minimum wage, does it have any impact on the economy? If we introduce a minimum wage to people that earn $1.14 a day in the security sector, and you tell them your minimum wage is $1, you've basically done nothing. You've simply told us to continue with whatever we are doing, have our discussions from where we are and above. So the minimum wage has to, in a way, affect us. In the labor market. It has to affect us in the private entrepreneurship ventures, such that we can question whether we are above the minimum wage. But if you set your minimum wage to what no one is discussing right now as a living wage, it will simply be a law that we passed to comply with the International Labour Organization provisions and the East African Community agreements, and basically has no impact. We will probably talk about whether it is being respected, which will not be a question because no one can earn below 50,000 and stay in that job, or 90,000. So that also is there. The area I find that we have not talked about is the free market area that Africa is moving at, but also the East African community has already embraced. What do we do when our minimum wage is lower than Kenya's minimum wage? What do our professional workers do in that question? What do our, so we have not talked about the equity patterns within the region. When Tanzania begins to take all, or the Kenyans begin to take all your professional people because your minimum wage is anyway lower than the Kenyan minimum wage, and our economy then begins to drain on professionalism, and then we need to keep borrowing examples and borrowing best practices, and then we keep learning and being schooled by our neighbors. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And I do not know whether you're shocked or you're bored or you're stunned, but I'm going to carry the conversation back to the audience. Yes.
Johnson Turnbull is my name, Youth Advocacy Foundation, Uganda. A colleague of mine who works with an Asian company supervises 3 Asians who are under him, and the fortunate bit of it, or the unfortunate bit of it, is that they are paid double plus some units the salary he gets. They get more than he gets, yet he's a supervisor. The reasons being that they are expatriates. And the company being owned by Asians, who are the colleagues, it puts him at an angle of where he's not sure of being a real citizen of Uganda. And he has been asking himself, without options and without answers. So it's high time we got the minimum wage, not just to open space for discussion on both employees' protection, but also the consumer protection, because the population will as well grow the economy, in that we are getting more people, the population paying both direct and indirect taxes. And many times you find that these investors commit to contracts, which contracts they do not own up to. So it is high time to have a minimum wage, because it even succeeds in sustaining the economy, which is a dream for every sovereign state, in a way that it will be less dependent on the donor monies or the donor funds, if we were to have it in that on that aspect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other there's a hand at the back.
Thank you. Kasozi Mulindwa is my name. The Honorable MP was talking about investment and why emphasize investment over your own people. Now, when we talk of wages, we are talking of economy. And before you can talk of giving wage, you must know that money is earned. Now, if you have failed or you are not able as a country to earn in order to pay your workers, and people can come in and do that, then that is a first consideration. But basically it's that before you can think of a wage, you're thinking of how to earn that money. So investment is very important when you're considering wages. But the other thing is, let's talk amounts and figures. So 50,000, 90,000. Could we talk of 300,000? Would that be something that can resonate with all of us? Because you see, when you talk of labor economics, you're dealing with optimization. You're talking of simple things like cost minimization and output maximization, yes? Issues of production. Now, if you're going to have 300,000 shillings for everyone, being paid to everyone, how many of the industries or the entrepreneurial ventures that are happening in Uganda can afford that? So I think again it borrows to what the gentleman said earlier. We need more empirical evidence to make these arguments better. But as in my consideration, minimum wage for Uganda is a no-go area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other person? There's a lady just in front of you.
My name is Lillian Mugero, and I'm the legal and strategy advisor for the Platform for Labor Action. Of course, the debate for the minimum wage has been on for years, but I just wanted to, I'm a lawyer by profession. So basically when they bring economic arguments in the issue of minimum wages, it makes the vulnerable groups unable to engage. So I would prefer we engage from the historical development of where we started even getting into the global economy, that is colonialism. And when you look at the whole regulation of the minimum wage, since independence, tea was regulated, cotton was regulated, sugar was regulated, even jaggery. If you trace all that, so I'd like to put that discussion in that context. That even the people who introduced colonialism to us and the trade we're talking about have evolved as they've moved along. And you never have an economy where all sectors are the same. So the conversation needs to be sectoral because the way we operate, our population is very high. Therefore, we are unable to address each and everyone's economic needs. But if you looked at it from the sectoral point of view, you're able to understand that sector. And where I've come from, I've ever met an economist. One of the leading ones in the country. So I told him we need a minimum wage, and he told me what is happening in the tea sector. How is the market? So we cannot talk about the standardization of having one minimum wage because each sector has its own global trends. For example, right now, I'll give you a sector that probably never comes up into the discussions, vanilla. The market for vanilla now, farmers are getting around $100 per kilo. It's a boom. So if you're dealing in tea, you're dealing in sugar, you know, you want to understand the vanilla sector, for example. It's a new sector. And probably people are minting money in that sector. So I've been provoked to talk. I decided to watch the space so that I understand the issues. But we need to appreciate that the conversation of the minimum wage is real. We need to protect the vulnerable people, the marginal ones. I'll talk about, for example, domestic workers. Everyone in the middle class who is a working man, who is a working woman, employs a domestic worker. But us in the city are not the same as those in rural areas, for example. So you need to understand, can municipalities, for example, set different wages? And you spoke about going to the same market. We do not go to the same market. There's capital shoppers, there's Nakasero market, there's St. Bali Kudembe, there's buying on the street. So all those are different choices you make based on your level of income, probably, or your own choices. So I just wanted, I was provoked when we say it's a no-go area. It's a go area. Majority of the populations are marginalized. We are all employers. Much as we are employed elsewhere, we are also employers somewhere. And therefore, we need to be part and parcel of discussion, and it needs to remain vibrant, and we need to support the need for a bill for the minimum wage. And I propose that we chase it from our history. You know, why all of a sudden when the market is so unpredictable that we start talking about non-regulation? Poor people need to be protected, minimum. Remember, let me use the basic example. Minimum means you're setting a standard based on which other people should act. Thank you very much.
Yes, please.
Can I use just a few seconds?
Yes.
I was touched by submission by Comrade Kasozi Mulindwa, and when he raised the point that we have to get comfortable with the predatory conditions of foreign investors, because for us as a local economy, it looks like we've proven we can't earn money. So I was requesting if the panelists can pay some response to that. Have we given up that as a local population, all that we have to look up to for economic progress, it has to be foreign investors? Or is there some space for us to join our resources and also build our local capacity to a moment where we have a strong voice to competently negotiate with anyone who wishes to bring foreign money into our economy? Or is it a gone story that we have to give up and just listen to?
So if you have a criteria that leads to the minimum wage being achieved, and it takes into consideration the basics of life, then at the back of the mind of the framers of that law, and specifically that section, it's a bit clear that they had in mind something close to a living wage. Now, whether is a different question, because the board can decide to completely blind itself to the realities and say electricity can be afforded at 2,000 shillings. It's also possible.
All right, thank you very much. I will have Mr. Owere.
Yeah, thank you very much, Isabella. First of all, I just want to echo issues about informal sector. In the last International Labour Conference, which was held in Geneva, the international organization now recommends informality to informal, to formal sector. And as we talk now, there's already a convention which is on, and they are finalizing with the papers to ensure that informal sector becomes formal sector. And it will enable governments to actually ratify that convention, and will also cascade to all countries and down to the level, so that we at the union level as tripartite also make arrangement to see that the informal sector becomes formal. Because they have seen that 90% of the most economies are now run informally. So that one is already addressed both at international and at local level. Now, somebody talked about the legal regime. The bill actually is, there's that aspect, but our position as it targets, the target group is both public and private sector. And then when you come to legal regime, there's a setting where you have to start from the ministry. Then we have international consideration, the machineries we have concerning creation of minimum wage fixing and so on, according to conventions. And we have Convention 26, Convention 30, the recommendations, and so on. So there's a legal regime. And the council will also agree with me that there's that. But how do we put them together? Now, what we also need to do is to support this bill to a certain level. And then the issue of living wage and minimum wage. You know, when you want to build a house, you start with the foundation, then you continue. So minimum wage is the foundation, and then you move to another level. So this is very, very clear. And some of us already in the, particularly the person who is speaking, because I'm also a worker. Most people, when I I talk about being a chairman general. I'm a worker, I earn salary. But because I have that power of negotiation with our bosses here, I've negotiated very well. Now I'm above what? The minimum wage. That's why I'm fighting hard to see that there's what? There's minimum. So when I'm talking about it, I'm really on board. Now, sectors versus the board. Now, this is where the issue is. But when we are talking about sector by sector, you know, sometimes when you centralize some of these things, the power comes to the center, and then you find that the sectors may be marginalized. But as we talk now, there's, I think, recommendation for one board to take care of. But that is it is debatable. And maybe another thing which I want to really to appeal to all stakeholders. In fact, my sister from the Platform for Labor has said it all, that we need to protect the vulnerable workers in this country. We need to do something. And I want to thank especially the Center for Policies Analysis. You've done something that I think today I'm going to sleep. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we are happy that we are part of the reason you will sleep today.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I will start with the response to the employer. I hear Platform for Labor Action very clearly, and I can only speak what members are in agreement. But I was just pointing to one thing, not being against sector arrangement. Actually, you move further to sub-sector arrangement. But I'm of the opinion that we have never been there. And we know how complex our processes are in Uganda arriving at anything. Now, I imagine a situation where we are having around 50 or so sub-sectors negotiating their minimum wages. I envisage that taking an extremely long time before we actually have a minimum wage. Because do you set a minimum wage when some sectors have not yet agreed? Do you wait for everybody to conclude their negotiations and then set a minimum wage? Because then the complexity was my main driving point for having one national minimum wage. And that's my personal opinion. I hear from the employer. Now, minimum wage versus living wage, he has simply answered it. I don't have any comment on that. The legal regime, I think this is part of the discussions that we are having now. This is one legal instrument, but there are several other legal instruments. So there will be broader reforms, not just the minimum wage alone. I've already cited, for example, pay as you earn. If you raise the minimum wage and then the pay as you earn is cutting this money, it's not a pay raise. So because you're just picking somebody from, now the threshold is 235, you're just picking somebody from where he wasn't paying tax to where now he has to pay tax. Have you increased his wages? In reality, not. And then we also have other arrangements coming for health insurance, deductions also will be made. So it has to be looked alongside those other issues. So I very much agree with you. It's not an isolated matter. And then he answered it in a very simple way, the informal sector issue, formalization of the informal sector. Unfortunately, it seems so simple, but that's the correct response. We cannot afford to work with an informal sector that is so large. I gave an example of what URA is already doing at the moment, to try and bring everybody into the tax bracket. That's a starting point. URSB, to try and register everyone. Ministry of Gender, to try and register every single workplace. This will take us a process to have a clear database of our businesses. I think the real issue is we need to be discussing how do we formalize the informal sector. So that's extremely important for us. And then again, back a bit to the sector discussions, we also have to look at it from the angle that we also have SMEs that have got to develop. So if you have an SME that now has to deal with a minimum wage that is way, way high, and he cannot access money easily from a bank because interest rates are high, he has power issue, he has to pay rent in dollars. So let's take all these issues into account. When we speak, somebody was saying we are speaking for foreign investors. Not at all. We speak for, especially from the Federation's perspective, we speak even for the very small businesses. They will have a real challenge to address this. Don't look at a minimum wage as a big business issue. It will also be a small business issue. So if it is so high, some of us who are actually business people here, you will get to understand really how it is. You skip sometimes paying your workers at the current rates, but that might be complicated. So that we need to take into account. The other issue, we look at it from the compliance angle. As we look at this minimum wage issue, let's also discuss issues of compliance. How shall we guarantee compliance? Because we have already highlighted a lot of legislations with very low levels of compliance. We don't just want a law, but we also want a law that is enforceable. So that's extremely important. Now, the other issue which I already highlighted, I just want to reemphasize now that the Honorable is around, is the equitable representation on the board, so that we have an arrangement that is fair to all. Before you came, I was just highlighting that you're making the employer a lone ranger in a sea of other people. So those issues should be discussed. But like my brother has already highlighted, as the employers, we are going to engage with NOTO and then bring forward a joint position. I cannot speak conclusively on this bill because I've not yet been mandated. Once consultations are done with the employers, then I can conclusively present the position of the employers. But right now, what I give is my personal opinion. I need to reemphasize this disclaimer because it's important. Thank you.
Thank you. I will also start with a disclaimer. I'm supposed to be neutral. That has always been the disclaimer that we are repeating here.
Yes.
The questions I raised in my keynote address were, do we need a minimum wage legislation? That is the question we are now supposed to answer. We have a law in place. We have looked at it. It has its deficiencies. The honorable member will maybe hint on that. Is it sufficient for us? And the answer, in my view, is it has terrible defects and it cannot give us the minimum wage that we are talking about. The bill we have, does it cure those defects? My view is there are provisions that are proposed in this bill that cure those defects. My sister over there talked about the minimum wage being protected by the legislation, existing legislation that we have and the Constitution. I believe this bill is based on the Constitution. It complies with the provisions of the Constitution. It's the mandate of the government to ensure that the Ugandans have a decent living. When we come to the bill itself, in my view, it is self-sustaining. Clause 5 of this bill clearly indicates the mandate of the board that will be established. It is going to be regularly advising the minister recommending terms of employment. These may be aimed at protecting the minimum wage. We are also talking about having one board. Is it possible? This bill, I believe, makes it possible to have that board. Does it take care of all the sectors? Is it in position to do that? I believe there are adequate provisions in this bill proposed to that effect. The bill proposes to have those persons that are being talked about, government, Federation of Uganda Employers, and even the labor unions. Those are not the only people that are going to participate in these investigations. The bill further proposes that we have assessors, and these assessors are determined depending on their experience in particular areas. So if areas require special expertise, then the expertise will certainly be available in the form of those assessors. So there will be no big problem in regard to the different sectors. We having people that are not experienced in those sectors, I think that has been adequately taken care of. So in the final analysis, in my view, this bill, if supported, will help us eradicate the problems we have been having with the current act, and it will lead us to the living wage. Why do I say it will lead us to the living wage? When we look at clause 8.7, clause 8.7 of this bill clearly indicates what is supposed to be looked at when we are determining the minimum wage. Whatever is stated in here in clause 8.7 leads to a living wage. We are talking about a minimum wage, but eventually when you do the investigations and come up with the minimum wage, it will certainly take you to a living wage. I will encourage members here to read clause 8.7 and the details in there and determine whether they take us to a living wage. So it is double-edged, living wage and minimum wage. We shall get there if at all this bill comes into law. That is all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will start with the experience of Kenya. Kenya has a minimum wage. It's the minimum wage that always puts the trade union against the employer. And they have to have a discussion on the table because the trade union is strong on their stand and the employers are protected by the law.
If we cannot achieve a trade union that in every sector, then we are not protecting the nationals that will form the majority of the labor force in every sector. So we need to start our preparations right. If we want our minimum wage, then we must have strong trade unions, not just their presence. Secondly, the idea of a living wage, I agree that the framework provided for the determination of a minimum wage encompasses the idea of a living wage. The only difference, my great colleague here, is that we do not have the same situation afterward. A living wage fluctuates with economic patterns. Minimum wage fluctuates with legislation. So the living wage becomes a question of stability of the economy, and the minimum wage becomes a question of legislation. Now, for me, that is where the stalemate will be. Do we always go back to amend the provisions of the minimum wage if the economy stability is not guaranteed? So we need to have stability operators in our economy. I do not want to speak a lot more, but I want to say one more thing. The experience of South Africa. When you are dealing with labor legislation, it needs to be comprehensive so that everyone feels protected. The employer feels protected, the trade union feels protected, and the very labor force feels protected. So if our legislation in the backyard is not protecting in some areas, for instance, I was just sharing, I am not a lawyer, but I was just sharing my little knowledge of the law with a land senior, I should say, Honorable Adeke here, that if we still have contracts provisions of oral nature, then we cannot uphold in those provisions the implementation. And that was also hinted by the senior gentleman over there. And so we need to therefore go back to our backyard of legislation and be able to improve on all legislation to encompass the ability of operation of a minimum wage. my final position is the question of labor force. If we are going to introduce a minimum wage into this economy, then labor force must be informed of their particular opportunities in such a discussion. For instance, if we do not know as labor force coming from university where the labor is necessary and where it is not necessary, where the labor laws are restrictive and where the minimum wage is probably higher, we will not be able to relate well with this minimum wage provision. So for me, there needs to be a manpower survey in this country. So labor can also have direction in this discussion. If I want to work in the agricultural sector, I need to know whether there are actually opportunities there, and that will inform my position of advocacy for the minimum wage. If I'm trying to talk about the engineers, I need to know what the situation in employment is for the engineering field, so I can also be able to participate to my advantage. I find these to be pertinent areas that we need to address.
I thank you.
We'll now take Honorable Mwine Mpaka.
Thank you very much. Apologies for coming late. My name is Mwine Mpaka, and I'm the Youth MP for Western Uganda. I did not capture much, but when I sat here, the first thing I heard was minimum wage is a no-go zone.
And I'm very happy someone reacted to it. First and foremost, minimum wage is very important in this country. The National Development Plan has identified it, that is 2009-2015, as one of the initial steps we need to take to gain a meaningful level of employment in this country. You have seen our president emphasizing on household income. Household income, in all his projects, you have seen him talk about coffee, tea, improving people's household income. Household income is the total collection of income of people staying in a given place or area. Now, you cannot eliminate, because household income therefore also includes wages and salary. So there's no way you can have people improving their household income without this minimum wage. Let me give you an example of China. China and the USA have a federal minimum wage system whereby each state has a different minimum wage. And this is what I would support as an individual. You look at China, financial states that are developing, that is Shanghai and Shenzhen, their minimum wage is about 2,000. I think their currency is called a yuan. The pronunciation is a bit difficult. Yuan. You look at the poor states like Guangxi, it's about 850. So in Uganda, I don't see why we do not adopt this minimum wage on a federal kind of level, whereby, for example, Kampala would have a bit high minimum wage, and areas like Soroti, Bulu have a low minimum wage. And it has worked because in China, it has forced the labor-intensive factories and industries to move into the rural areas to set up. Those ones doing toys, those ones doing shoe manufacturing, those ones doing all those labor-intensive factories. You look at Uganda, and I think it was the International Organization on Migrants made a report in 2013, and it stated that in Acholi and as a sub-region, the level of unemployment there is 70%. Now, if we establish a federal kind of minimum wage whereby we are pushing these factories to our country, I think we are going to have increased employment. Two, even the states, the countries, that claim to have to be developed and they do not have a minimum wage. We have Sweden, we have Switzerland, we have Norway, we have Iceland. Sweden, for example, this is the first challenge for abolishing minimum wage. However, whether you like it or not, minimum wage is a bonus.
In Sweden, they say they do not have a minimum wage and they are developed. But between 60% to 70% of their population is engaged in unions. And it is these unions that influence the salaries these people are getting through a process called, I think it's called collective bargaining, done by these unions. Here in Uganda, recently Nakumatt workers striked. Nakumatt workers have a union. When they striked, the union was called and their salaries were increased. We should stop using cosmetic language to say that we do not want a minimum wage. It is already upon us. We just need to make it bigger. So, those few words, I did not get so much, so I cannot react. I came there, but my view is we need the minimum wage in this country. However, we must discuss it further. China's federal minimum wage system has failed to improve the standard of living of the people because of they have a poor social insurance system. What does this mean? It means the workers there have to save. They are not sure, they don't have a good health system. They have to save in new stock markets, they have to save in so many things. Someone on the panel talked about it, increasing having a minimum wage when someone is paying a lot of pay is also not important. So we need to discuss it further, but I think minimum wage is very good for this country and it will create employment for our people. Thank you.
Honorable Wakajaga.
So
public, including even the workers, they think minimum wage law will affect. So there are these issues that have been raised.
especially government officials. Because in Uganda, the investors we have in Uganda, they are actually public servants. They use the money for investment. Even the foreigners you talk about, they have interest in those investors, public servants. Therefore, our struggle is them, and I know that you think I know it. And that's how they do business. I took up this view. I was given the degree in 2000. I finished my work. I wrote to the Ministry of Finance. It is a I gave it back. As I was producing the new vehicles, I found the Public Finance Management Act. I found it. Section where I can disclose well. So I wrote to them first time. I wrote the second time. And the act said, if someone asks for some certificate of financial education, and you want to support for 60 days, go ahead and do it. Without a certificate of financial education. It is the first bill that has been tabled without a certificate of financial education. And it is important. So, I propose this proposals that you have now. The intention is not to hurt either the employer or the employee. How would we go about it? Therefore, the bill was process to have a representative. And the employer what is worried, it is equal numbers. Half assessors, these are confusion. This level was on that. Half assessors on that board. Here, the board member analyze the board something. That should be said. After thorough research, we have many laws that cannot be removed. The Rule Act. It fails because it cannot be removed. People take their ruling, their own self. So, how do you implement minimum wage law? The policies identifies this. After identifying them, do the thorough analysis of how someone in this sector minimum then fix minimum wage. To me, I thought that would be the case. As I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, the deal is before the court. I want to thank the same policy analysis for having done this decided and the dialogue that we discussed. We will be for the court and we will go across the balance to say how best the law. My main job was to start and then we get now the list that is accepted. And that a law that can be or enforced. And hence, then
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Honorable. And his submissions have brought us to the end of this session. I will ask Mr. Emmanuel Chitamirike to come and formally close this event. A big thank you to the panel, a big thank you to the audience, a big thank you to our online audience. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you so much, Isabella, for the wonderful job that you've been doing. Let's first appreciate ourselves and the panel for the discussion. Honorable, I had something that I thought you could respond to. I was told that if a parliament comes to an end, for a bill to be resurrected, there should be a motion on the floor of parliament. So have we resurrected this bill in the 10th parliament?
Can I ask you?
Yes.
True, we went into a different session of parliament. But I worked with the speaker and the bill was saved. So it can be even start by tomorrow, the discussion. Actually, the committee is tasked to start the deliberation about the bill. Anytime.
Thank you so much. I was a bit worried that our discussions may not add value, but we are happy to learn that it's already up for the 10th Parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, when we came here, there was one principal question. Is the minimum wage legislation a relevant law right now in Uganda, in what someone will call a liberalized economy? Now, you're going to agree with me that at the end of this discussion, there have been so many answers, but there have also been so many questions about the minimum wage legislation. But at least there has also been a lot of learning from some of us about this bill. I think for me, the greatest controversy is going to remain in how do you implement this law within the informal sector. A young man who goes to Tseka to look for 5,000 shillings, or someone who is providing labor on a farm. I don't know how that is going to happen. I think we are going to have challenges, and yet these are guys who actually need this much more than some of us who can either, like Mr. Owere said, negotiate with our employers better, or we belong to some kind of union, so the union can do work for us. So I think there is so much work to do. I think passing the bill will be one, but implementing it will be a bigger task. I want to let members know that we've been gathering all the contributions. We are going to develop a comprehensive policy paper from this discussion, but also subsequent research. And we hope that we will have an opportunity to present this as soon as the committee opens up public consultations about this bill. Before we go to the committee, I'll let you know that as long as you provided us with the email address, we will share with you the paper, so you can be able to make further inputs to ensure that we present a more representative position. I want to let members know that again, we'll be having another, what I will say, interesting discussion. And this discussion is going to be about the 10th Parliament. Now, why I'm calling it interesting is because we've never had the kind of parliament that we have now. First, look at the numerical strength, 427 members of parliament. The other day I was seeing some of them standing during plenary. Now, those are the realities that we have. So questions of how effective can this parliament be in that undertaking its mandate, I think will be important.
The other reason why we need to have a focused discussion on the next parliament or this parliament is because we're in a transitional period. Now, some people will argue that we are not. Actually, some will say we have been in transition for the last 30 years. At the time when we thought we were going to have a transition, the constitution was changed in 2005, so the transition continued. Now I know that we have one president to stand for the next term of office. So from a layman's language, I think we are going to have a whole discussion centers the 10th Parliament in a very position in terms of going to see Museveni. We manage the transition. But even the fact that if Museveni is interested in being around, how is the 10th Parliament going to manage that? So that is the discussion we'll have when we call upon you. Please kindly honor our invitation, and we have that discussion. On that note, I want to thank everyone for your time, for the contributions. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.